Welcome to our Leaders Agenda podcast series, where we explore trends, ideas, and imperatives that are shaping the way leaders must prepare themselves and their organization for success and growth. Our guests include life sciences leaders and domain experts who share their own experiences and learnings, along with hard data and practical advice that will help you build your own leaders' agenda. It's time for all of us to reimagine innovation to serve the evolving needs of patients and customers, to create new capabilities and capacity for product delivery by letting go of practices and beliefs that limit organizational agility and growth, and to transform our work cultures to empower teams and individuals to chart their own course for best value and outcomes. Our guest today is Gary Pisano, a researcher, educator, and thought leader on strategy and innovation. Gary Pisano is a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School, where he also currently serves as a senior associate dean for faculty development. He has just recently co-created 2 new executive programs at Harvard, driving profitable growth and strategic agility for turbulent times. But most of us know Gary Pisano as the thought-provoking author and educator who has written over 100 articles and case studies and 6 business books on how organizations innovate, learn, compete, and grow. Gary draws from his extensive research across several industries, including life sciences. His latest book, Creative Construction: The DNA of Sustained Innovation, prompted much of our conversation for this program. In addition to his academic research and teaching, Gary Pisano serves as an advisor to senior leaders at leading companies around the world, and he has also been the director of both public and private company boards. I'm so delighted to have Gary with us today. Very nice to have you join us this morning. Where are you this morning?
I'm in Concord, Massachusetts, where it's actually reasonably nice weather by New England standards.
By New England standards, that's absolutely right. Yeah, so it's been quite cold out there for quite a while now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are having a conversation this morning about creative construction, about innovation and culture. And so before we get started, though, I know that there are several people in the audience who already know you, but and they can read your bio. But I want to ask you that simple question. It says in your book that you are a world-renowned researcher. How do you consider yourself? Are you a researcher? Are you something else?
Well, I love research. So I love doing research. Yes, part of me says I'm a researcher, but I think of myself as an educator. I want to educate people. So I educate in a lot of ways. I educate through my direct teaching that I do at Harvard, and I educate through my consulting work. I educate through my books and articles. Hopefully people read them and they're educated. But to be a good educator, I think you need to be a good researcher. You gotta be out there digging. And so I think of really the two going hand in hand.
And the areas that are your focus and have been your focus for quite a while, innovation has been a consistent focus for many years. Anything else that is sort of a big thing for you as a researcher and educator?
Well, yes, there's a lot. It's actually, innovation is a big part of what I do. And I fell in love with innovation as a field. I mean, it's why I went to graduate school. Back in the early 80s, I got very interested in innovation. So that was my first love, it really, as a scholar. But I do a lot of work on this organizational design and the structure of firms. My economic training is in a branch of economics called contract theories, which is about how you design organizations in some way to make them efficient. So that's a fairly broad area that has implications for innovation, but has implications for lots of other areas. I also do a lot of work in operations. I'm in an operations group at Harvard Business School. My group is called Technology and Operations Management. So I taught on manufacturing strategy, and manufacturing has been a big part of my interests. Going back to the work I did on the Producing Prosperity book, on the role of manufacturing and competitiveness and restoring American competitiveness through manufacturing. So manufacturing's been, so I've really straddled the world of manufacturing and innovation almost equally, actually.
That's very good. Thank you for that. And I think I've read at least Development Factory was also had quite a bit about the the innovation inside manufacturing as well, which
Exactly.
Yeah.
That book was really that book really straddled both sides of my career, right? And then other things I've written have been more on one side or the other. And creative construction, of course, is all about the innovation side of the equation.
That's wonderful.
What prompted you to write innovation construction, Gary?
The creative construction. Yeah. What was that's a great. So it sounds like it was a little bit. The idea first came to me. I was working with a client, a large client of mine had come to me and said, look, this is back in about 2011. They said, look, we need to grow. And, realistically, we haven't been very innovative over the last 20, 30 years. We've been really good at, incremental stuff, refinement, being very, very efficient with our manufacturing, very good at our marketing. But we really need to think about changing our whole organization to become much more innovative. And this was coming from the very top. This was coming from the CEO. And they said, can you help us? So I said, sure. We thought about the classic kind of arrangement where we run a series of workshops and then follow up with the client. And they kept asking, is there anything we can read? Because I had a certain approach to teaching innovation. Which was thinking about what's your innovation strategy, what are the systems, and what's the right culture. I thought about those as three key pieces, and it kind of worked. It kind of made sense for me. I'd always taught it that way. It was very natural for me to think about it that way. And they said, well, can you recommend a book to read? And there was no one book. There was a lot of very good books on innovation, but they all captured a piece of the innovation puzzle. So, and there's a lot of books about disruptive innovation. There were books about crowdsourcing. They're very good books, but they capture a piece. And I said, what's needed is a kind of primer, if you will, for if you want to go down this journey, what do you need to do to become innovative? Now, in particular, along the way, what I recognized, or something that had been kind of bothering me at the same time, was I think a misconception about the role that scale plays in innovation. So over and over again, folks kept saying, and you could read it everywhere, that look, big companies can't innovate. It's only small entrepreneurial companies. Mm-hmm. And it just didn't square with a reality. That is, there's a pattern, of course, but there's lots of exceptions. And the idea that, there's no natural law that says scale has to be the enemy of innovation. And in fact, if used properly, scale can help you with innovation. So that's kind of got me to merge those two themes of just kind of a at one level, a book that really takes you through the innovation journey from start to finish, and what do you need to do, and the foundations of becoming an innovative organization. But in particular, I tilted it for larger enterprises, many of whom clients I kept encountering had sort of given up on the idea that they could become great innovators again, because they'd just been told over and over again without any evidence that, you're big, you can't innovate. And that's
that's not exactly an inspiring message either.
No, exactly.
You talk about this idea of I think you used the term reborn innovator, which I loved.
Yeah,
right. That's interesting. Now, we work with a lot of these very large companies in the life sciences side that they've been around for a long, long time, and they also have multiple business units and a lot of complexity. And you just said, well, there's no reason why that scale should get in the way, but there is something that you need to know how to do. And I think you also mentioned the failure rate of transformation being very high. It's something like 70%.
Yeah.
So is there a I know you say no magic bullets, but is there a magic wand for making innovation? Yes.
For becoming innovative.
Yeah.
Well, you need people you need the leaders with the right mentality about what's involved with innovation. And when I say innovation, I mean really more transformative innovation. So lots of organizations are good at the routine innovation. They're in their groove. They can execute that well. And they can almost do that without thinking. That is, if you basically said, don't think about it, take your hands off the wheel, they would continue to innovate the way they had, because they have a whole set of routines which are set up that way. But then when they have to start to really do something fundamentally different, is there a magic wand? No, I don't think there's a magic wand. But what I tried to highlight in creative construction was the key principles that you can keep in mind that really help. I think the first thing is, look, you have to allocate resources to the effort. That's the strategy part. You can't talk about being innovative if you don't have a means to put resources into the kinds of projects that are going to lead to transformation. The second is you really need to know how to do it. That is, you don't become a transformational innovator by wishing to be one or by spending money on it. You need a very different set of processes to do breakthrough. I'll use the term broadly, breakthrough or transformational innovation. You need a very different set of processes. It's a highly iterative approach. It's very evolutionary, if you will, in terms of how ideas evolve. When you look at breakthroughs, they emerge over periods of time, and there's a lot of trial and error. And you actually need to systematize that, and you can. It's not random. Okay, folks don't come up with breakthrough innovations because they're sheer luck or because they happen to be Steve Jobs. They do breakthrough innovation because they actually have capabilities and routines designed to do that, just like they have capabilities and routines designed to provide incremental innovation. And the third piece is culture. I mean, it's a mentality around learning and we can go into more detail about those elements, but I think a lot of aspects of innovative cultures are not well understood. But I don't think these are principles that say, you can't apply them in an organization of larger scale.
Yeah, I like the principles, and I do want to maybe go to each one of it just a little bit deeper, and then actually we'll spend more time on the culture. So we'll start with the strategy side of it. And I know that what you're saying is evidence that you have a strategy is where you actually allocate your resources. That's where your strategy is, right? Yep. But strategy is also a word that is used in all kinds of different ways. What I was fascinated by in your book was your definition of strategy, which you said, strategy defines patterns of behavior and priorities, but it needs to be very simple and clear. And I really like this: eat more vegetables and exercise more, and how that translates to a very clear set of guidance that anybody can take. So can you talk a little more about that, and how do we get the large company to really articulate a strategy that's clear and is more than about that bottom line, which it tends to often be?
Yeah, so I think strategy is one of those concepts. You asked me earlier, what else have I worked on other than innovation and manufacturing? Strategy's been a big part of what I've done as well too. Within that, I sort of tie them together. But I mean, strategy to me is fascinating. It's one of the most misunderstood or misused words in business today. And you think about today, what companies spend on strategy development and strategy consulting. And I think very few companies have strategies. Now, again, I get a little biased sample because in my nature of my work, I'm called by companies, they help us with our strategy. But very often, even companies who ask me to do something else for them, and I ask them what their strategy is, they hand me an 80-point PowerPoint deck. Right. I'm totally lost. I have no idea what it's about, but I figured, well, I'm new to the organization here. I maybe I don't get it. And then I started asking people, tell me what the highest priorities are, and I get different answers from everybody. And then I realized, no, everybody's confused. Strategy is a commitment to a pattern of behavior, right? So strategy is one of those things. A strategy is fairly simple in the sense that it should articulate a hypothesis about the business, right? About how you're going to win. Let's talk about competitive strategies here.
Yeah.
Right? But it's hard. So it's like the classic, it's simple, but it's hard. To get it to that point of a crisp logic that makes sense to everybody in the organization and is not full of fluff is a very hard mental exercise to go through. But at the end of the day, it doesn't require 80 pages. In fact, I like to say it takes a really, really good strategy is on one page. This is true of business strategies, and it's true of all strategies. If you think about A huge organization like Walmart that became very successful, their strategy was pretty simple. It's let's put one large store in smaller towns that can afford one large store, but not two, and let's be low cost. That's what it was about, right? That it's a very now there's lots of other things that fall out of that, but you kind of get 80% of the way there with just that statement, right? Which is we're going to go into smaller towns that can afford one big store. And the reason we want to have big stores is because that gives us low cost. Right? Small towns can afford one big store, but not two. And let's make sure we're the first. And that's the story.
Yeah.
Southwest Airlines, the same thing. It's very consistent, small, compact, highly logical strategy. That's what you find throughout. And you need the same thing for innovation. Yeah, for innovation strategy, you need clear logic. Like, why are you innovating? Like, what is it you hope to do? How is innovation going to help you win this battle? You're competing. There's other companies out there. They want your customers. Okay, they're fighting a battle for value creation and value capture. So how does innovation help you? So it's not just a good thing, but it's got to be clearly articulated. Here's the kind of customer it will attract. Here's the kind of value it will create. That's a tough thing to work through. But once you work it through, you can get it to a really crisp kind of principle. If you have a crisp statement that everybody should understand.
How many companies actually do that in your experience?
So few. This is what I find frustrating about the strategy creating process. Strategy has become, and yet there's no shortage of really good work on strategy. And going back to my colleague Mike Porter at Harvard, created some great work on strategy that people could put into practice, and many others. Strategy, I don't quite understand why it's become so convoluted, and it's a very something maybe I'll look into and try to understand it. But it's become, I think it becomes a very political exercise. So the challenge with strategy is about choices. And choices are hard.
Right.
And so a lot of times strategy comes down to, I use the analogy, you can have chocolate ice cream or you can have vanilla ice cream. Okay. But what happens is some people want chocolate, some people want vanilla. So what does the company do? They compromise on swirl, right? And swirl is terrible. Nobody likes swirl. It's like neither chocolate nor vanilla, but like half the people, like sort of everybody's okay with it. It's like a truce. That's not strategy. Strategy is, look, I've thought it through. Here's the fork in the road. We're going this direction, not that direction. Yes, I'm sorry. You're unhappy with that. In fact, I always tell clients an acid test of a good strategy is it doesn't make everybody happy because it involves a sharp trade-off.
Right. Which kind of takes us back to which we'll talk more about culture and leadership in other ways, but it does take it back then to the leader's role in strategy making, right?
Huge.
And so at some point you have to have that courage to say, this is it. There will be probably some people who don't agree with it. Maybe they will leave. That's the risk, but you have to be clear.
And you might be wrong. So this is the other reason why strategy is hard to do, because it involves a commitment. And so as a leader, you sign on, you say this is the strategy. Okay. But you might be wrong. So if we say we're going down road A, not road B, it may turn out that road B was a better road and road A was a bad road. You can be wrong. And so I also find like there's this fear of making commitment. And there's, you don't always want to make commitments. Sometimes things are uncertain, so you have to keep options open. That's a different issue. That's strategic agility, and I teach a whole exec program on that and how to think about strategy under uncertainty. And you don't always just dive. Okay, but there are times where you have to commit, right? You can't keep all your options open all the time, and you commit, and you might be wrong. And that, I think, to a lot of people, you want people in leadership positions who say, "I'm willing to take this. This is how I feel. I feel this is the right decision." But I'm also willing to tolerate the consequences of the fact that I might be wrong. And again, I think for some people, that's a message they don't want to hear.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's go to your second point then, which is this innovation system itself, how to do it well. And that includes also then, I think, all the different interdependencies in the organization between the structures and processes and practices.
Yep.
So I want to specifically ask you to maybe think about your experiences with that. So, and if I look at life sciences today and some of the large organizations, there's a transformation effort after transformation effort after transformation effort in one organization. They multiple different ones. One is around quality system, and one is around digitization of R&D, and one is about something else. And each one of them have touch actually the same people. Each one of them has a cultural initiative as part of it. But when you start thinking about how they're going to roll out, they're not necessarily integrated. So how to do it well? What have we learned? What have you learned in your travels?
With the transformation effort or building the systems?
Building the system.
Again, keep it simple. Look, as I say, innovation comes down to three. The system has to do three things. How do you innovate? It's search, synthesis, and selection. A search for new ideas. How do you do that? Right? Yep. Where are the ideas coming from? How do you get ideas on your radar screen? How do you broaden that? Synthesis. How do you start to bring ideas together and test and evolve? And then how do you select what to do? What are your criteria? So I'm a big believer in the way organizations complicate things. If you can simplify things,
yes,
which again is hard to do. Steve Jobs used to say, I think he used to say, simple is hard. So from an organizational design point of view, if you can simplify processes, it goes a long way. What ends up happening is folks just layer stuff on. So they say, oh, let's add this governing body. Let's add this group. Well, this group's responsible for this. And it's group upon group upon group. And then it's a very complicated machine, and you can't innovate that way. So you have to kind of have to scale it back and say, what's the essence of this? What's the lean process look like? I'm a big believer in process. I don't think process is a problem for innovation. I think if you have good process, you don't need bureaucracy. What ends up happening is organizations don't have good process, so then they actually resort to bureaucracy, which ends up being very slow. So keep the but think through the process, design a simple process that people understand, and then really get good at that process.
Absolutely.
It seems like Jamie. They very often confuse process and bureaucracy. They're synonymous in a lot of organizations' thinking, and they are layering on things because they don't have a simple, clear process. That's very much been my experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to ask this, Gary. What's the measure of innovation? How do we measure innovation?
Well, it depends for what purpose do you want to measure. So I would think about if you measure something, there's the reason. So tell me the reason you want to measure what you want to measure, like what purpose, and then I'll tell you what I think I might be able to think of an answer.
Let's do it first on the industry level. To define a company that's an innovative company, what would you look at to say that's a company I would consider an innovator?
Look, I think at the end of the day, innovation actually drives the total factor productivity of the company, right? So innovation actually makes the company, and people say productivity is all about low cost. That's not true, because productivity, there's two sides of the productivity equation. One is value created. So it's the value, the resources used, right? Divided by the value created, the value created divided by the resources used. So, you can think about that is sort of a measure that we often use in our research, thinking about total factor productivity. How much better are we using the resources over long periods of time? But I think you could also look at, if you really want to measure it, and we do this in our research, if you think about the organizations that change the direction of an industry. Mm-hmm. So that's now I could give you a quantitative measure in a second, but qualitatively, if you look at the organizations who launch products or services that in some sense permanently change the way something gets done in the industry. So that afterward, it's kind of a pre and post. So you say like people talk about Apple, and we talk about the mobile communications industry. In fact, we say mobile phones. They're not really a phone, right? I mean, my iPhone is not really a phone. Okay. Right. And there's kind of that world pre and post iPhone. That's that. Or you think about other products which have come along, and there's kind of pre and post. There's kind of pre and post Google when we think about internet search. Yeah. And so that's one way to think about who a transformative innovator is. They permanently sort of change the paradigm, if you will, of either the design or the service architecture or whatever it is. There's something, and they've done something no one else has done before. So I think about precedence. They're doing something unprecedented, and it sticks. Now you can try to measure that, and we do that in our research. I've got a new paper out on breakthrough innovation that I've worked on with my doctoral student Dominika Soneca, and that where we use patent data, because you have to use patents. Are imperfect, but they are the best fingerprints you have for the kind of work we do. You have to have some kind of fingerprints. But you can look at the citations to the patent. So what ends up happening is breakthroughs often have lots of citations back to it. So they kind of permanently, that's just one measure, not a perfect measure, but there are measures like that if one is really into measuring. But I think when it comes to breakthroughs as well, I think organizations, if they want to benchmark themselves and see how they're doing, they just have to ask the question, what have we done that has been unprecedented that others have then followed?
Yeah.
How has that changed things? How has that changed this business?
So Jamie, I know you dying to get into the culture conversation. I have one more question, if that's okay. And that's because the first time I met Gary was when I read Science Business.
There we go.
Okay. And I know actually a couple of years ago, I called him up and I said, hey, everything that you said in 2006 about science-based enterprises pretty much came true. So where's the next book? And he said, but I'm working on this next book. It's not just about life sciences. And he was in the middle of creative construction at the time.
Probably, yeah.
But you said a couple of things there actually that were very interesting things, and I want to kind of go back to. One of them was science creates novel business requirements that cannot be fulfilled with our existing organizational and management approaches. And the whole book was really about, how does a science enterprise come together? What does it look like, and how does it work, and how does it need to be managed and led such that the science can flourish, but the business is also a viable business? And I think that one of your last things there was that biotech was just taking off during that time, and you said, well, we're still learning. After 30 years, we're not sure that we know this yet. Do we know something more now?
I think we do now, yeah. And I think part of the point I was trying to make in that book is the science was running ahead of business. In fact, so what was going on, the whole purpose of in that book, I think the argument was the convergence of science and business was new. These things had typically lived in very different worlds. There was a world of science, which was the world of academia and research grants and government-funded labs, with some exceptions. And then there was the world of business, which is all about profits and secrecy, different norms, et cetera. And then with biotech, we started to bring them together. They're coming together. It's well, these were never meant to be together in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, they were never meant to be together. They had never been together. So I think the first few decades of the biotech industry were all about improvising and figuring out the business side, because the science was kind of taking care of itself. It was moving ahead, but we were borrowing. That book was critiquing, but not to be harsh, because I think it's all folks had to do. But folks were borrowing from other industries. They said, well, how did software? How did that work? How did venture capital work in electronics? And those did not have the unique requirements of business. They didn't have the same conflicts. I think there was a lot of mismatches. And I think a lot has changed. I think we've seen a lot more evolution and more sophistication in business models, a lot better thinking about how to fund companies. And that doesn't mean we're not going to make mistakes now, or we're not going to learn. But I think the business is much healthier today. In fact, I actually think it's we're still early in the game. I still think this is going to be really the century of kind of biology and life sciences. So I think we're still early in the game, and commercially, and look, during this COVID crisis, we got to see the transformational effects of life sciences.
Absolutely.
But we also got to see, by the way, what are we struggling with now? It's distributing vaccines. So that's the plain old, right? That's the science moved quickly, and yet where are we on the management side and our healthcare infrastructure? And
we don't have a system for the.
We don't have the system, and that's true everywhere. It's it's not just the U.S. It's true. I just got back from Europe. They're struggling like mad with this in Europe. fact, actually, the U.S. has been doing bad. Everybody's been beating on the U.S. The U.S. is not doing bad on the COVID vaccines now for distribution, but it's still
Which
pretty
is very
clunky.
interesting. Yeah. But I think also in the science side, what is interesting to me and what I'm seeing a lot more of now than if I even just go even 5 or 10 years back, the partnering in the innovation side is magnified right now. So I mean, I almost feel like we have a hybrid industry now. So we call it still the life sciences, but life sciences is really now pulling in partners from outside of life sciences, and you know, we kind of go into the next level of advancement on how we think cross domain, which makes it even more perhaps more difficult from a leadership and management perspective to really understand how do you pull these things together and make it into that productive innovation machine, if you will.
Yeah, sectoral convergence is a fascinating area, and I actually have some work I'm doing now on it. So sectoral convergence is when two sectors, which have historically operated independently, come together. So we think about what's happening in autonomous vehicles. It's the convergence of automobiles with artificial intelligence and computer science. So right, that's coming together. Robotics in car. These are separate industries, and they're coming together. Or and I actually am doing the work I'm doing now. My research is actually historical. It's actually looking at World War II production of aircraft and military goods. Because of the huge volume needs, what happened is the U.S. government, had no choice but to bring in non-military goods producers for things like aircraft. So Ford was a big, Ford and a few companies, not many, but you had Ford, General Motors, Goodyear produced airplanes, Nash, who was an appliance maker, produced helicopters. And so what you had is they had capabilities and skills from one sector that had nothing to do with aircraft. And they moved into they had to produce aircraft. And so, and by the way, the aircraft producers also learned a lot about mass production from these guys. The one group had mass production capabilities and skills, but knew nothing about airplanes. And the other group knew a lot about airplanes, but they had never produced airplanes in volume. Airplanes were not produced, military aircraft were not produced in high volume at all prior to the World War II. It was craft production. And then they come together. And that's actually where a lot of innovation occurs in economies, is where sectors collide. And it's like, if you want to use the genetic analogy, it's like you get a hybridization, which can lead to even more powerful sectors.
Well, what's interesting that you mentioning that to be World War, it was a war, right, that partly triggered that cross pollination, if you will, and now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we've seen the same effect. So sometimes some new discovery comes out of a crisis, and in the dire need that you're really looking for something that can change things fast.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
So Gary, I want to talk with you. Have you talk to us a little about leadership and culture? Why do you think, or how difficult do you think culture change is?
So culture change is very hard because it's like deeply embedded. It's like the DNA of a company, but it's also culture change is difficult because so think it broadly, and I think I mentioned this in creative construction. I'm not sure if I actually mentioned this in creative. You kind of forget because you write, and then you edit, and you write, you edit, and then they take stuff out. So. But I think if you look at the history of the world, over the history of civilized humans, if I recall correctly, there's been like 500 years in our entire history where there's been no wars going on. Right. Like over the last, say, 3,000-4,000 years, whatever the number is. Just a few hundred years where we have not had a war going on. And you think, why do humans get into all these wars? Well, if you start looking at the causes of those wars, they're actually cultural conflicts. Okay. There's some which are economic. So one group says, hey, you've got gold and I want your gold, so I'm going to come take your gold. And the other guys fight back, say, you're not going to take our gold. So sometimes it's economic, or you have oil or whatever it is. But a lot of times it's about belief. And I'll put religion under culture to maybe broaden it a bit. But now, and so culture is like deep. It's like people's beliefs. And culture actually, it's no surprise that actually what you see in organizations when they want to go through cultural change, it's organizational warfare. That's what's happening. You got one group who's saying, I want to change. I believe this, and I think my belief should be the dominant belief. You have another group who says, no, I think my belief should be the dominant belief. Now, thankfully, they don't, they don't use the instruments of warfare, but they use other.
Sometimes they do.
It can feel that way, right?
Yeah, it can feel that way. Passive aggressive behavior and all that. So, because why? I mean, it's highly competitive. So you've got a competitive situation. It's almost very Darwinian. And if you've ever been in an organization where you're part of the dominant culture, it's a good place to be, because culture determines not just what's important, but who's important. So it's nice to be important. It's nice to be recognized. It's nice that your behavior is one that the behavior that you like to do is rewarded and makes you more powerful. That's a good thing. And if you're in that position, you're not so interested to see the regime change. Right? And so people fight back. And that's what it is. That's what's going on. It's competitive battle. And so that's why I think one of the problems of culture change is, so often you read the work on culture. Let me come at it. I'm an economist by training. Economists have never studied culture. So I've come at culture from maybe a different angle. So a lot of times you read the work on culture, and in all due respect to that work, it's a bit like, let's all, let's kind of all understand each other, and let's just kind of sing Kumbaya by the fire, and let's bring people on, and you got to, as a leader, get people to be inspired. And I agree, you got to get people inspired, but it's not recognizing the fundamental problem, which is you've got a war going on, right? So if you recognize that it could be a war, then you're going to approach it very differently. And I honestly think a lot of culture efforts fail because you say, like, let's all change in this direction. Let's all embrace this view. But people don't necessarily want to embrace that view. And then the leader doesn't actually want to deal with the fact that some people don't.
Right.
And I actually think when you've seen cultures change in organizations, they're often when the organization's in dire straits.
Right.
And a lot of times I get asked this question by executives, can you do culture change when you're not in dire straits? And I say yes, but actually the record shows most companies wait until they're in dire straits, and then you get cultural change. And then I usually add to that, I don't recommend that as a strategy for senior executives, because usually at that point part of the transformation is you get rid of all the senior executives, so and get new ones in.
Their part in it is to leave.
Yeah, and I've studied this a bit. I mean, I wrote a case study on Fiat and both the Fiat transformation and the Fiat Chrysler, and got to know through this process the late Sergio Marchionne and how he approached that. And when you're in that kind of desperate situation, you almost have license to people in the organization are going to give you permission to do it. There's a lot less resistance because it's like we're all losing here, right? I need to keep my job. I hope to keep my job. And they recognize in some of these contexts, people are losing their jobs. So people who have jobs are happy to have the job. It's a very different context. You're desperate for your survival. But when you're not desperate for your survival, I think the other things start to play a big role in terms of people wanting to protect their way of seeing things, their vision. And you can always argue, if the organization is healthy, that my vision seems to be perfectly fine. So why should we change, right? We're not in trouble.
How do you see the role of the senior executive team in culture change?
Well, it's huge. I mean, to me, we often hear it's euphemism. Oh, it's leadership. It's all about leadership, and it gets overused. But I do think with culture, it really does matter with the leaders, what they say and do and model and how they behave. And that is just absolutely critical. So if you have senior leaders, and unfortunately, it doesn't take many to mess it up.
No, it doesn't.
And you need, and culture change is not one you can just wave your hands around and outsource it. You have to put a huge amount of energy into it yourself as the leader, and you have to engage in a term our former dean at Harvard Business School and my good friend Nitin Noria would call it retail leadership. He talked about sometimes you just have to go out and talk to a lot of people one-on-one. It's not like some big town hall. And I love that term, and I love that concept. And I have to say, I've stolen it from Nitin many times in talking to clients and others about, sometimes you just have to get out there and talk to a lot of folks about in this case, your belief in what the values should be. But I think it's, I think there's several layers, and I think about a lot of that culture, organizational culture, and cultural change. I mean, there's two aspects. One is scaling a culture of an organization as you grow, and I talk about this in creative construction, which is as you grow. One of the problems is the culture that allowed you to be so innovative when you were small sometimes doesn't scale. And then what happened? And if you think about organizations who are phenomenal at scaling their culture, the best are actually religions. Religions do an amazing job scaling. If you think about it, they do an amazing job scaling their culture. They set up behavioral norms, which they get hundreds of millions of people to follow over centuries and sometimes millennia, right? It's actually quite impressive. And all religions, this is fascinating, and I'm way out of my league as expertise. I'm not a religious history scholar at all. And I'd love to learn more about it, and I'd love to see if folks who are professionals in that field have looked at it. But it just sort of occurred to me as a kind of thought that they all seem to have similar kinds of approaches to building a culture, right? So you have a leader. The leader articulates the vision. The leader, by the way, doesn't do it all. They actually build the site. They build followers, right? Who play a big role in helping to cascade. I always say in organizations to leaders, you have to send the message, but you can't talk to 50,000 people one-on-one in this organization, right? So you better make sure your direct reports are going out there and talking to their people. And their people are talking to their people. You have to cascade. Okay.
Well,
you have to have stories. You have to have, yeah, go ahead.
But what you just said is the word, they build followers. I think that oftentimes we think that if we create the PowerPoint on the vision and we create the few characteristics that we want to have in the culture, we give that PowerPoint to everybody and then we send them off. That's building followers. You're talking about something totally different.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because culture is all about behavior, and behavior is deeply personal. So when you're asking people to change their culture, that's a vague statement. What it really means is that I'm asking you to change your behavior. Now it's personal.
Yeah.
And so and you need, religions have stories. They actually invest in building culture. They actually institutionalize the culture. As you think about every religion meets, typically, I should say every religion, again, I'm not an expert, but most of them have a day of the week they meet. Different religions have different days or times of the day. And this is when they convene. And what do? They talk about their values. And so often in organizations is they don't do culture like they do it, as you point out, with the PowerPoint slide, like we're unveiling our corporate values and that's it. And an organizational culture is a social contract. That's what it is. It's an agreement. Like this is how we're going to behave. So you have to build that contract. You have to communicate that contract. You have to build stories around that contract. You've got to cascade that contract. And you have to enforce that contract. So if people don't behave accordingly, they can't be part of the group, right? And
you have to call them out, right?
And you have to call them out, and you have to hold people accountable for that. That's the way we do it. Now change gets hard. You talk about that's just scaling and growing a culture. Now, what ends up happening is, if you change, you have to change the social contract,
Right.
And that's another wrinkle to the problem, which is, well, now we've all bought into this for so long. And by the way, religions don't change off. So the religious analogy breaks down because they tend to stay the same in their culture for a long time. That's kind of part of their thing. They can't change their beliefs all the time because people would lose faith in the religion quite literally. Say, wait a minute, 100 years ago you believe this, now you believe something else. This isn't permanent. So religion needs permanence. Organizational cultures don't need permanence. They have to adapt. So but so there you have the added wrinkle of, we've bought into this culture as a group. We believe this culture works. For the last 50 years, we've heard stories about how this is what's led to success. And now you have to force people to revisit that. And that's definitely not going to happen with a PowerPoint slide and here's our new corporate values.
And it seems like if it's about changing behavior, it's also about changing beliefs and values and assumptions, right? And getting those off autopilot. So it almost has to come off autopilot to become visible, so you know what it is you're actually trying to shift.
Absolutely, and it's going to be uncomfortable. I mean, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
At the individual level. It's very uncomfortable.
Which
right?
then brings me back to your paradoxes that you talked about in the creative construction and also in your
Mhm.
article, The Hard Truth About Innovative
Yep.
Cultures, right? So there were 5 paradoxes, I think: the tolerance for failure and willingness to experiment, psychological safety, collaboration, and flatness. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about those. Where did they come
Yeah.
from, and what's the paradox within each one of them?
Yeah, I mean, it grew out of the fact that for so long, everything I had been reading about culture of innovation, and frankly had been teaching, and I teach with numerous groups, we'd always teach about, you need a tolerance for failure, and we need to be willing to experiment, and you should be collaborative, and you should have high psychological safety, and you should be flat, and uh, you know, everybody was always gung ho about it and excited, and then you kind of go out in organizations, and they're not really doing this, and it started to get like puzzling, and people in organizations, you say, why aren't you doing it? They typically point up, well, I believe this, but my boss doesn't, and, kind of keep going up higher and higher. And then you realize, well, there's nobody else to point to.
Right.
And it was bugging me in the sense that I was teaching something that I kind of thought was right. I mean, I thought it was right, but I was like never seeing it happen. I was rarely seeing it happen, very, very, very rarely. And I thought, this is odd. And it bothered me for a long time until I realized what bothered me about it was these are cultures that these are behaviors that everybody seemed to embrace and want. And I literally ran an experiment one day live. I was talking to a client in front of probably 300 people or something. I can't remember the number. And they asked me to talk about culture, and they didn't want me to use PowerPoints. I walk out on the stage, and I said, what do you think an innovative culture is? And they gave me basically that list, some version of that list: tolerance for failure, psychological safety, willingness to experiment, collaborative. And I said, how many of you want to work in an organization like that? And they all raised their hand. Like, of course, who wouldn't want to work in an organization
I was
like
just
that?
going to say, who wouldn't,
Fantastic.
right?
It's nirvana.
Yeah.
And then I said, how many of you do work in an organization like that? And they're all from the same company. And like nobody, basically, I think one person raised their hand, was the person sitting next to like the CEO or the highest ranking person in the room or something, trying to court favor. And that was the kind of, it was very, as I call it, not I said an experiment. It wasn't sort of a scientifically done experiment, but it's kind of back of the envelope experiment. But it bothered me. It's like, what? That's weird, right? Like, here's something you all love. Like, you all told me, and you're all these were senior people.
Yeah.
Like, these were very senior people in a big company. Like, you all love this stuff. You all want to do it. You all want to be part of an organization that does it. You all said this is good for you, and yet you're not doing it. Like, what is it? Like, what else is going on? This led me to sort of start to question, there's something else needed. And then I began to kind of go back and reflect. And I was still reflecting during this time about other things I had seen in innovative organizations. And while I had seen these characteristics, I had seen some other things. And that led me to start to think about, wait a minute, maybe you can't just get one side of the equation. You have to have the other. And I think I use this analogy in the book about a world in which ice cream is good for you. And it's like, yeah, well, ice cream's good for us. It's like, well, but there's some bad news too. It's only good for you if you put kale chips on top or something. It's like, oh, well, kale chips. I can have the ice cream without the kale chips. No. You have to put the kale chips on top of the ice cream. Then it's really good for you. And that's kind of how I feel about innovative cultures, which is, do you need a tolerance for failure? Absolutely. 100%. Everything people say about tolerance for failure is absolutely right. But what I noticed in organizations which are highly innovative, they have an intolerance for mediocrity. And to be provocative, I call it intolerance for incompetence. And I don't mean gross incompetence, but it's like they expect people to be on their game. Like, it's one thing to be, I failed because I was trying something, thoughtful, but kind of hard, unprecedented. I couldn't do it. They don't have a problem with that. I failed because I did a really sloppy design. I didn't think about things. They don't have time for that. That's not what they're so, and suddenly you get this edginess to it. Like, you mean, not everybody is promoted, not everybody gets the same bonus. No, you mean some people get fired because they're not good? Yes, and that starts to get scary a little bit, right? Which is, oh, wait a minute, now I can't. So that's these organizations which are highly innovative have this edge to them, and things like the willingness to experiment. They experiment, but they're super disciplined. Like, an experiment matters. The data matters. We react to it. And maybe my favorite paradox to this, I don't want to drag you through them all, but is this psychological safety and this candor. And to be provocative, I call it brutal candor.
Yeah.
And some people react negatively to it. Oh, that candor can never be brutal. You should never be brutal. And I say it in the book, and I say it in the article, and I say it in every speech. I'm not talking about being brutal like like as a personal thing, but I believe that candor itself can be extraordinarily painful for both the giver and the receiver. And we have to recognize that too. And if you've been working on something, so you want to be brutally candid about ideas. The way ideas get better is we apply critique to them. We apply, in an evolutionary term, the term is selection pressure. We beat up ideas. You have an idea, we beat up your idea. But the idea is we don't beat you up. We want the idea to get better.
And you're beating the
it's
idea,
your idea
up, not the person, right?
Yeah,
right?
But that said, right, your idea, like you've been working on this for a while, like you love this idea. So when I'm attacking your idea,
I take it personal.
As politely as I can, you are going to take it personal. It's going to be painful. I give academic seminars. I get up in front of groups. That group beats the heck out of my ideas. Okay, most people don't dislike me, so I don't think So I have no reason to take it personal. But you do one of those seminars, you don't walk out of there feeling particularly good. That's like, you don't walk out of there, I can't wait to do that again. It's hard. And so lots of times in organizations, you watch what goes on in meetings where ideas are discussed, project proposals. There's no candor. They won't be candid. People say, yeah, it's a great idea. And then what happens? Outside the room, something truly brutal does happen normally, which is outside the room, okay, I go to Jamie and I say, Jamie, Tarsha's idea, I don't know about that. But I say it quietly. I say it behind your back. I think her idea is really flawed. It's a bad idea, etc. Now, that's problematic in all sorts of ways. It's toxic because it creates lack of trust. Maybe I'm totally wrong, by the way, and you have no opportunity to defend yourself. Okay, and assuming in this case, Jamie has to make a decision based on that. I mean, now he's misinformed. Now I'm harming him. I'm hurting you because I'm hurting your reputation. I'm hurting him because he might be misled. Yeah. And even, maybe you're right and I'm wrong, right? Or maybe you're wrong and aren't you better off knowing you're wrong? That you actually have an error in your data, your logic, whatever it is, so you can make it better. But if I don't tell you that, to me, that's the ultimate disrespect. So critiquing somebody's idea is respect. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's respect. If I just nod to you politely and say, that's got some merit, I'm fine with that. And in the back of my head, I'm saying, that's really messed up. That's disrespectful. So, and I've been doing work lately on surveys of organizations looking at the balance of how these paradoxes, and measuring through sets of questions. I've developed a survey instrument, and it is fascinating what you see, that the gulf between organizations which think of themselves as being psychologically safe, where people feel very free to speak up, but rate themselves very low on candor. And that's like saying, those two things go together. My point is, and psychological safety is a concept my colleague at Harvard, Amy Edmondson, has worked on and done pioneering work on for a couple of decades. And to me, it's extremely important in innovation. You absolutely need that people need to be, that freedom to speak up, that willingness. They can't feel intimidated. But I think what's often not recognized by folks is that's not a freebie. So when people are free to speak up, you're now in a very candid environment, and candor can be really brutal. And if you're not prepared for it, I think people duck it. So what I find paradoxically, companies rate themselves, people say we're very high in psychological safety, we're very low on candor. And it's like, wait a minute, you feel safe to speak up as long as you're, BSing each other. That's not the way it works. And you're never going to be innovative that way. Innovation requires candor.
Absolutely. But I also like this idea of that accountability coming in multiple ways in these paradoxes and tying it back to the performance. So if you have, and I think Amy even talks about this, if you need to really think about having high psychological safety and also high performance standards if you're going to have a high performing environment, right?
Absolutely.
So, which goes right back to the candor and being able to hold individuals accountable.
Yeah, and these things connect because high accountability, like if I know I'm being held accountable for a decision I make, there's no place for me to hide.
Yeah.
Then I'd be absolutely crazy not to seek candid feedback from you on my idea. Like I would be nuts. That would because like the last thing I'm going to do is make a dumb mistake. And I talk about in the book, Dwight Eisenhower, and like basically a few weeks before the invasion of Normandy, where he lays out the battle plan. The first thing he says is, "We're here to get a better plan." So if you have problems with the plan, if you have criticism, it's your duty as officers. And he basically says, "I'm not going to tolerate anybody, regardless of their rank, who won't criticize the plan." That's a pretty powerful thing. And I always ask leaders, how many of you go into a meeting and say, "We're here to criticize my plan so we can make it better"? But if you think about Dwight Eisenhower, I mean, yeah, he was talking about, he's being held accountable in the eyes of history for, the balance of World War II and several 100,000 lives. Now, most of us will never experience that level of accountability or pressure, but you want organizations where people say, "Look, you're accountable. So at the end of the day, we're going to hold you accountable for this. You do what you need to get the right decision." It strikes me, it behooves you to go talk to a lot of people and listen really carefully. There's no, there's no, I've heard the phrase once, there's no upside in being wrong. I mean, it's just, you've got it, but that comes from accountability. If you're in an organization where we can kind of hide behind committees and other things, then do I really need to hear the feedback? No, because I've got places to hide.
Well, we work in the science business. And so one observation that I would make there is a lot of people don't get really trained on these things. When you say, okay, I need, thinking about it from a leadership development perspective, this whole idea of putting yourself vulnerable, asking for feedback, and having the courage to sort of make decisions, all of these things that are inherent in your paradoxes, they speak to a need to develop leaders a certain way. Is there a right way to develop leaders? I feel like tons and tons and tons of money goes into leadership development every year, and those are staggering numbers across the globe. But are we getting a return on leadership development? And if we're not, is there time to innovate leadership development?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. I think some of leadership development is very, very good, and some of it is, less so. I think it needs to focus on, how do you develop some of these characteristics in people? I think they can. I think most things can be trained. I'm not a believer like innate. I mean, there's some, we train people in lots of things. So does innate ability help? Sure. But even people with strong ability train and learn. So, the top professional athletes, people say, well, they were born gifted. Well, yeah, they also practice, 8 hours a day. So that helps. And so you can train. So I certainly believe that training matters, and people can develop habits of mind. Doesn't mean everybody's going to come out in the same place. No, but I think everybody's going to be better off. How do you get people? I mean, part of it is the characteristic of you have to have a certain degree of confidence. Some of that just comes from experience. I think it's getting people out of habits that they may have developed in one world. So in the academic world, if you have scientists who come out of academia, depending on the subculture they were in, sometimes candor is a very nasty candor. Mm-hmm. If you go to some academic seminars and watch, and it's sort of like, I can get points for taking down the speaker at the seminar. They're not there to help the person have better ideas. They're there to be the smartest person in the room.
Right.
Now, can that person change? Sure. If they realize that you're not there to be the smartest person in the room, you're there to make the ideas better. Now, on the other hand, if they are so intrinsically, they love being the smartest person in the room and they can't ever help themselves but be the smartest person in the room, I would suggest that's not a person you want in your room. So, because they're going to be toxic. So you have to screen, you have to understand what you're looking for, right? So that's one. But I think you can train this, and I think you can mentor it. So this is again the one-on-one, the mentoring, and developing people. Like if you see somebody, I mean, some people don't know how to be candid. They want to be candid. They mean well, but they come across wrong. I think that can be developed. That's a level of maturity, but also, it's probably there's technique to it. How do you do it? And good leaders train people and teach people and call people out, let them know. It's part of their development feedback, which is, look, we love the candor, but you're also being offensive. So we want you to help improve ideas. We love that, but you're doing it in a way that actually leaves people feeling a little raw. So that's fine. That's the kind of mentoring and feedback people can get. So I think a lot of leadership development has to occur, not in the classroom, but it's the mentoring. It's that retail leadership that we talked about before. But can leadership development help? Sure. And I think you have to be systematic and strategic and think about what skills you want to build in folks, where their shortcomings are, et cetera.
Very good. All right, we're going to be coming down to our time over here. So, Jamie, I want to first put it out to you because we just talked about leadership development, and I know that you spent your entire life on leadership development. So, while I look for my last two questions for closing, how about you? You comment on that leadership development part.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Gary had to say about it. I do think you do have to get people off autopilot. And when you say out of habits, they're habits. When you want to create a new habit, you've got to leave some old habits behind and identifying what those are. And then it has to be very conscious and deliberate. And if you don't stay conscious and deliberate about it, it just people will go back to autopilot, and the culture that will take over. And I also found it very interesting the idea that we're actually in that it's a war. This idea of a culture in a war. I think that would be a very helpful perspective for lots of organizations. If they don't take it sort of seriously at that level, they're not likely to succeed. And a lot of them don't, in my experience. Some do, but the ones have to take it very seriously and be very committed.
Absolutely.
So in summary, I have my last two questions for you. All right. The first one is for that listener, the leader, a senior leader that knows that their company needs to build new capability now for innovation. And they also know that their practices and behaviors have to change as a result of it dramatically, or they won't survive. But they feel the burden of time. And you said this is an evolution, not necessarily a revolution. What should be their first three things they do?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. First three things they do. I'd probably, I think the first thing is, again, it depends sort of the burden of time, like how desperate, if the company's desperate versus not, but assume they have enough time to do something. I mean, I do think the first thing they really have to do is get clarity around why are we innovating? Get a group of senior leaders together and talk about innovation. Make sure you define this word. It's overused. Be clear about what you mean about innovation. I think that's number one. And that's kind of part of setting the strategy around innovation. What are we trying to achieve with this thing called innovation? And what are we going to do? What are we not going to do? So I'd spend some time on that up front. I think, and I think that doesn't take a lot of time. The culture part does take time. And that's what worries me when you talk about what they don't have a lot of time, when you put yourself into a situation where, but I think you got to start really fast on it. So you could start fast. You don't have a lot of time, but it means you're going to keep doing it. So, it cannot be flavor of the month. It can't be, we're desperate to do it this year. We really have to innovate. Let's become an innovative culture this year. It's like, no, we're going to start right now, but actually we're not going to finish for 10 years. And we'll be better off in a year from now than we are now, but we're going to be far from perfect. But let's start immediately. And I would start with that social contract. I'd say what are the behaviors that we have. Let's think about the behaviors that we have that we want to keep, the behaviors that we have that we want to get rid of, and what are the behaviors that we don't have that we want. Just put them in get it down to a clear social contract. And I guess maybe this was really the first thing is I'd get the senior team together to clarify. The senior team has to be on board with this journey. And if you don't have a lot of time, you don't have a lot of time for dissent either on it. So you've got to be real clear. This is the direction we are going. and you better have your own clear vision about things to bring people along. And the less time you have, if things are getting desperate, the industry's changing, et cetera, you don't have time to wait, and you don't have time to start, let's bring everybody along slowly and get everybody on board. You're going to have to find those people in the organization that you have, or bring some new people in who can light a fire under it.
Mm-hmm. And sounds like you got to be prepared to really invest your own time and your own energy in that culture side of equation as well.
Huge,
right?
huge.
Yeah,
That's
huge.
The best leaders do that. They don't think about culture as something they do periodically, or it's not outsourced. I mean, good leaders own strategy and they own culture. And are there people who help them with it? Absolutely. But they own it and they're accountable for it.
I love that. That's a great way to end that conversation. But let's turn back to Gary Pisano. What are you curious about right now? What's next for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work now. I'm still on innovation, breakthrough innovation, and applying, thinking about the connections between innovation and evolution, how evolutionary processes work and how innovation processes work, and doing that work jointly with Nubar Affian, who gets news a lot lately. Nubar and I have known each other for 20 years, and I've worked with him. And of course, people know him now from Flagship and Moderna. He's a co-founder of Moderna. And so we've been working on an article on that, and hopefully maybe even a book about bringing kind of the ideas of evolution into management practice and innovation practice through breakthroughs. So that's very exciting. In fact, right after I get off this call, he and I are going to be speaking. And an area that I've worked on the last few years that I'm still very curious about, and it's related to innovation, but different, is company growth. So why do companies stop growing? So every company talks about they want to grow. Every senior leader says growth is number one on their agenda. If you look at the data, and I've done some research on looking at long-term patterns of growth, very few companies grow very fast, and even fewer companies grow fast for sustained periods of time. They have growth spurts. They're like adolescents.
And then it kind of.
And then they just go back to the mean. A few die out, but is it just they regress to the mean? And it's the kind of weird thing. It's like it's almost frustrating. And why is it? Why do companies stop growing? What is it about growth processes? So the course I teach at Harvard Business School is my MBA course is called Driving Profitable Growth, and it's all about growth and trying to understand the dynamics of growth and really, and that's another one of these topics I think much talked about, very little studied in a rigorous and careful way to understand deeply what's going on, how growth processes work in organizations, and then how those growth. I actually believe that growth is a process, right? So and if you want to understand then why it stops, you have to understand how that process breaks. What is it about that process that breaks? And I think by understanding that, we can get to the answers and then enable organizations to do a better job, managing their own growth. So that's really that's the breakthrough innovation and the growth stuff are the two big areas. I always have a bunch of other projects going on around healthcare and other things, but those are among
fascinating and beautiful questions to be asking. I have a feeling we'll be seeing you some more. Hopefully, absolutely. Also in these video podcasts. We've been mentioning a couple of really important currently out articles. One is the article on Harvard Business Review. The name of the article is The Hard Truth About Innovative Cultures. Mm-hmm. And that talks about the paradoxes. So I just recommend that to our listeners. And then, of course, there is this book. Mine has a lot of sticky notes, so I can prove to you that I've actually read it. But if someone wants to get this book, what's the best way to get it?
Good old Amazon.com. I think that's the best way to find books these days. There's other outlets, but I find if you just go to Amazon.com, it's there and ships pretty quickly. And I hope folks will enjoy it. And if they read it and have thoughts, they should email me and send me their thoughts.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time and this excellent conversation.
This was fun. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please share your thoughts and continue this conversation with us by reaching out on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. This program was brought to you by Action for Results, a life sciences consulting organization specializing in building innovation, product delivery, and program management capabilities, and making cultural transformations stick. You can find out more about our services on our website, actionforresults.com.